Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of guests for today. First, we have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a former member of the Maryland House of Delegates and former county executive. We have also Judith Hawkins, former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. We also have with us Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the general counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have with us Mr. Stephen Allred, who's the director of government relations for the Church State Council. Great to have you guys here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there was an important win for two Christian students who were in a situation where they were initially told they were not allowed to express their faith in God at a school talent show. Westwood Elementary School in Michigan initially said that there was an issue with them performing songs by certain Christian artists. The school told one of the students that he would need to change his song. A letter was eventually sent to say that this is a violation of their constitutional rights. The letter also wanted to let them know that students should not be allowed to have to change songs or even change lyrics if it has something to do with connecting with their faith. Less than 24 hours, the school realized that they'd done something wrong, ended up making the change. But it brought up a very important issue as to when do you get to express your religious beliefs in a public square or in particular at a public school? You know, Stephen, one of the things I found interesting about this particular situation is sometimes you can't figure out how far can you go when you want to express yourself from a faith perspective, but in the same breath you're in a public audience, maybe even at a public school, and that may be offensive to people who maybe don't even believe in God. Or is there another way we should be looking at it? You know, Steve, what's your thought on that?
You know, Orland, I think you've kind of touched on some thoughts I had. And, you know, first of all, I'm sympathetic to the Christian students who want to sing these praise songs. I was a youth pastor myself. I've led praise music. I've had students who've gone to public school in my youth group. But I think the context here is important because this is a government-run public school talent show. And I think from a legal standpoint, at least, this is a bit more complex than First Liberty painted in their demand letter, which I read, to the school, because, they characterized it as a free speech case. Public schools can't censor students based on their religious viewpoint. But the real problem here is one of my friends who is an expert in this area, Ellen Brownstein, he's pointed out is that free speech cuts both ways. It's a two-edged sword. So if the government can't discriminate against religious expressive activities, it also cannot discriminate in favor of religious expressive activities. And I think a couple other issues I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on are if attendance at this talent show is required, for example, is the government then mandating that non-Christian students listen to Christian worship music, which some students might find objectionable? Is the government placing its imprimatur on the music and the messages being presented? And one other question, let's say that Christians find something that's objectionable being portrayed, like maybe a song with, some LGBTQ theme, kind of like your drag queen story hour type of thing. At what point do Christians get to say, you shouldn't have that speech, it's offensive to me? And so I think if we're going to say my religious speech must be allowed in this setting, we have to be ready for other types of speech as well, which might be offensive to us.
I found this case interesting, and as I read it, I immediately thought, Coach Kennedy, Coach Kennedy, Coach Kennedy. When the Supreme Court said that the coach could kneel and pray at the 50-yard line and that it was okay, with all due respect to our esteemed court, it totally ignores the reality of human nature, something called peer pressure and herd mentality and subtle messages. So for the law students who are listening to this case, it's really important that you can articulate your argument very succinctly. And this is how I would articulate this case. It's called the teacher, who called the parents, spoke with confidence. But the teacher failed to check with the chain of command. The parents then called the principal to complain about the teacher, but the principal failed to check with the superintendent chain of command. And as a result, it created confusion and chaos. And somebody had enough sense to realize they were getting ready to write a nice big check. And as a result of that, the letter came that says, oh, a lack of knowledge and a mistake. So what I would say is this case is, as far as I'm concerned, this has been litigated enough now that the school systems are aware that any attempts in this particular climate, now maybe a few years ago and a few justices ago, a few Supreme Courts ago, it would be different. But in this climate, I think that there's an active support of the Protestant and Catholic religious orientation. And we had this case or something very similar to it back in 2021, where a student wanted to sing a song and the school said there were too many Jesuses in it, and they lost. I think that this is what I would call a DOA argument, and we can litigate it all we want to. We can find the fine-tuned issues of a legal theory. But I've always said that the law is a living thing, and you need to understand the culture and the time that the case is being brought forth, because that is going to be very significant in the outcome.
I think that what's interesting here is, they mentioned that it was violation of these guidelines, right? And I think that, as Judge Hawkins said, you have this teacher who is kind of acting without first maybe consulting with the higher ups. And I was trying to find what these guidelines were, right? What were the other things that could disqualify a song? Because at least the way that First Liberty painted this, it was, well, the fact that there was a religious nature to these songs was the only reason that they were disqualified. I'd like to know what other songs were disqualified, right? Were there other students who were told that their music was offensive in some way? Or was this simply the school saying, hey, we want to step away completely from anything that looks religious because we don't want to look like we're endorsing religion here? And the school may be going too far in applying or in trying to not violate the Establishment Clause principles.
But Rashawn, I'm going to ask you a question as somebody who's a former legislator. When you're looking at these type of matters, you get pushback on the other side of the aisle that's saying, listen, if you want to be singing religious songs at this school, there are religious schools that you can attend and they've got all the rights and privileges to do so. When do you start finding yourself going over the line? And when are you just trying to be, quote unquote, neutral or safe in some way because you're running a public school?
I think, I think you're absolutely right. I think Steve started out right talking about what would happen if this was something else. I'm waiting for the case when the Muslim student comes in or the Buddhists and chants, and then, there is an uproar. But I do think, Judge Hawkins hit on it. This is a different era right now in this Supreme Court. When I started in the legislature in 1994, you couldn't say Jesus. That was a big deal when someone got up to open up the prayer at the General Assembly, which is required that you come to that opening. One of the things that they admonished people on was saying that. But we're in a climate now where the pendulum has swung back to a more open and toward a Protestant Christian United States. I think we're going to see problems in the future, though. So I think what the school system is trying to do, which all school systems run to now, is that now that there's been this opening of the floodgates that you can do things you couldn't do before, like post the 10 Commandments in the schools, have prayer, kneel at the 50-yard line, all of those things. I think we're going to see these cases come up, more so just to challenge what's the status quo. But it's going to be interesting to see how long it takes for the pendulum to swing back.
I'm not the daughter of a prophet, and I am not a prophetess. But I don't think the pendulum is going to swing backwards. As you look at the makeup of the Supreme Court and the cases that have come down, so I want to speak very objectively. As we look at what has happened in the Supreme Court in the last few years, there has been a total change of viewpoint, period. We cannot rely on past law, stare decisis, to give us any idea of where to go forward. And when you have courts who tell you, which are telling us point blank, they're not concerned about stare decisis and that they are actually using a different standard of how they are evaluating these cases, that's where the slippery slope started. And that's just going to float right on down into the ocean.
But Steve, you kind of hit on a point that, it's all well and fine when you're singing a song entitled That's Who I Praise. The question is, when you're singing another song that has a different title that has a quote unquote religious connotation to it, and it may be offensive to others, that's where it seems like it get a little tricky here.
Right. And I think that the Supreme Court, when they look at their, history and tradition standard, may be forgetting that our country has changed a bit since its, kind of waspy origins, if you will. We are a very pluralistic society. Some people don't think that's a good thing. I do. And I think we have to take that into account. But unfortunately, this court, I think, has also, really forgotten about the Establishment Clause, right? And so we have a whole line of cases we know that speak to this issue from that perspective that I feel like are being ignored nowadays.
But Jennifer, shouldn't we look at this also from a regional perspective? This is something that's happening in the state of Michigan. You might be able to look at things a little bit different if you're in the state of Oregon, or if you're in the state of California, or you're in quote unquote Texas. It seems as though you still have to take into consideration to some degree, the area of the country you may be in, because there are certain religions that are more predominant in other areas, and you can see maybe a less offensiveness, but can you totally take out the local community standard when trying to deal with these type of issues?
Well, I think this is why, these First Amendment principles of, non-establishment and free exercise, they should cut across all of that, right? So, because there may be different regions, like in Michigan, there might not be as much uproar about Christian songs being sung in public schools. In Oregon, there might be, but the principle remains the same. And I think that this is why we need to make sure that we're consistently applying that principle, so that, in every state, there are going to be minority faiths, and that might differ, the extent of what faiths may be considered minority or not have a voice. And this is why those protections are important.
Well, I have a question. If that should be so, and you have the Supreme Court issuing rulings which seem to be gutting it, will it play out? I mean, I guess my question is, if the U.S. Supreme Court is ignoring, that may be too strong a word, but if First Amendment rights are if First Amendment rights are being challenged, as they are, that affects all 50 states.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly the issue right now. The Supreme Court's deciding on those things that are Christian based. I'm waiting for the case when either the Mormon faith or Muslims or Buddhists in a segment of our population starts to do something in a public setting, and that's offensive to most people. That minority religion is what's going to happen, or the non-religion. But for right now, the Supreme Court has made it very clear that this is a Christian nation, and they're going to side with in these cases for those. So I'm waiting for the ones that push back and see if there's equality in the law.
Well, I'll let that be the last word, but I think dancing around the issue is probably right. And I think this is where we're going to find out in the long run whether or not we are, quote unquote, a Christian nation, or whether we are a religion that protects all religious activities, including those of Christians. There's an interesting case that's called Anchor Stone, in which you have a Chinese and Taiwanese-American church in Santa Ana, California, that purchased property in what was termed a professional district of town. And they wanted to set up an office facility, but they also wanted to conduct worship services there. The church completed the purchase, but after they were done with the purchase, the city of Santa Ana said that there can be no obstacles that should be in place. However, you cannot use it for religious services. All of a sudden, that change put them in a situation where it became untenable. They had met with individuals prior to doing their transaction. They closed on the deal. They wanted to do both an office and a worship service. And now they find themselves multiple years later not being able to utilize this property the way that they initially decided. And they are suing because they basically have damages of almost $600,000. Jennifer, I thought we had some laws that were supposed to protect churches from things of that nature. And I'm wondering, to some degree, is this having to do with the fact that maybe this is not, quote unquote, your average Christian church, but because it's a little bit of a different type of church, that all of a sudden now it looks like we have somebody who's caught in a bait and switch purchase and then told what you can't do. Am I missing something here?
I mean, you're right. There are some laws that protect, organizations in situations like this, right? We're talking about RLUIPA, of course, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of the year 2000. And this is supposed to protect individuals from these kinds of things occurring. And in fact, the church did sue based on RLUIPA. Because of this, the church did everything they were supposed to do. They talked to the officials before the purchase. They let them know how they were planning on using the space, and they were told it would be no problem. And unfortunately, as soon as the purchase took place, as you said, then the bait and switch occurred where the government officials said, "Hey, we're not going to give you this." The conditional use permit that you need in order to use the facility the way that you want to use it, right? And so now we have this property that's been vacant that no one is using because the intended use that was talked about at the very beginning, they're not able to do. And I think that you're right that, if this was a mainstream church that everyone was familiar with, we might not have been seeing these problems occur. But that's the reason that we have laws like RFRA and RLUIPA is because, we want to protect minority faiths. We want to protect practices and churches that might not be as familiar to people. And so I'm glad that we're seeing this kind of work its way through in this instance. And it looks like the court actually did intervene in this instance, and they did come to an agreement and allow the church to be able to function in this space. But this is why laws like this are so important to have.
Yeah, Orlin, I know you know this, and Jennifer, you're absolutely correct. This happened to me when I was county executive in Prince George's County, where a church, actually bought a piece of property that the city wanted them to see redeveloped. And so everything was fine until they found out that the church met on Saturdays, and therefore the community had a problem. And what happened was, just like in this case, they changed their mind. And so the council member opposed the church moving forward to use it as a faith. The community center was fine, but the worship on Saturday was not. And then the council, sitting as the district council, which oversees land use, sided with the residents. And what eventually happened? The court stepped in and cited the county for somewhere around $12 million because this case had gone on my 8 years as county executive. What it shows is this is definitely a bait and switch. They want to see a piece of property develop. They bring someone in. They figure it's going to be a faith community like theirs. It's going to be standard. They're going to meet on Sundays. And then when they find out it's different, then they change the laws. And so I'm glad to see in this case, as in ours, that the decision was made right. But
well, we might as well make it 4 until we get the 5th vote. When I read this case, that is exactly what I wrote in my notes. Bait and switch. And oh, by the way, it's a great way for the plaintiffs to earn some money, because the case just settled, in fact, on the 21st of August. And they ended up paying out $640,000. And I would like to know, as you know, I always want to know the backstory. I really want to know what happened in the back room, because what happened in the back room will tell us why we got the results we got. It is probably highly predictable that the city government was going to lose this case. Pretty predictable, and that they were going to write a check. And I wonder if the citizens are really impressed with having to write a check. In this case, it was only $640,000. In your case, you said it was like $12 million. That's a huge check.
Steve, what's interesting about this is, Mr. Baker kind of alluded to it, you have these jurisdictions that they start looking at your properties and they see the development taking place, and then you have a religious tag that's on it. Then all of a sudden it is off of the tax rolls now. Now you're no longer, quote unquote, paying taxes for your property. You seem to be exempt. And it seems like there seems to be some concerns happening that RLUIPA is trying to figure out how to get its arms around. It may be not so much the religious part of what's going on, but it might be the tax exempt part of what's going on. Have you seen any of that type of stuff in the past?
Well, I think I was actually thinking about that as well. Clearly, the thread between this case and the first case we talked about today is that whoever was making these decisions wasn't talking with their lawyers, or maybe not good lawyers. I don't know, because I mean, this is kind of a slam dunk for me for the plaintiffs here. But yeah, you can understand how a city would want to look at the tax implications. But I think that, we as a society, the reason we allow churches tax exempt status is because we believe there's some sort of a non-tangible benefit that religion and churches bring to society, right? And that's something that I guess some folks maybe have lost sight of.
I was just going to say, in our case, the city actually wanted the church to come in and build a community center. What they didn't realize is what type of church it was. And they're thinking it's the standard. And so that's where you get the bait and switch. The other thing that's interesting is clearly we knew that we were going to lose this case. But the council members who represented that district and the citizen didn't care. They wanted anything to stop this church from going forward because it interrupted what they considered their correct use of that area in their city. And so that's what you find a lot of times is it's not just they don't know they're going to lose. They do, but for political reasons and to be reelected, you're willing to go and write a check, even though it's going to be your check, for this amount just to stop these folks from, moving forward with the stated purpose of it.
Wow.
This also that legal theory of estoppel. Just a really basic principle here. I talked to you, we made an agreement, we understood, I relied upon it. And because of what you said and my reliance, I'm now damaged. I think also that this case ties in what we talked about earlier. We need some guidelines that are enforced all over the nation. We need some standards. We need to expect the same outcome in whatever state the case is filed. And so it doesn't matter what the locality is or the home cooking of that locality. The law says that if it is within the United States, this is how it's going to roll out. And with that, we can have some degree of stability, and lawyers will actually, if I were a lawyer, I would just increase my rates because I know I'm going to win this case either way. I'm going to win it because I'm telling the defendants you need to settle and they won't listen. I'm going to win it because I represent the plaintiffs and I'm going like, let them fight as long as they want to. We're just running the cash register.
Hey, Jennifer, how do you juxtapose the argument from some jurisdictions that say, at some point, we have enough churches to be able to take care of the people in this particular region? For example, Mr. Baker lives in a jurisdiction that has probably almost 1,000 churches for 1 million people. The idea that everyone now thinks the idea is, I've got a religion, therefore I've got a church, now I don't have to pay taxes, and a jurisdiction comes in and says, you know something, we don't mind having churches, but at some point, don't we have enough? Or is it never enough of a religion that whoever wants a church should get a church, find the land, build, and there should be no pump the brakes from time to time?
I think, going back to this case, there were opportunities if the city did not want to sell this land. They did not have to sell the land, right? But they had conversations with this church. They told them how they wanted to use the property. They said it was no problem whatsoever. And there are, zoning ordinances in place. The problem here is that this church was treated worse than other organizations would have been treated. It's clear that there was some animus here, that they were being arbitrary in how they were applying the granting of this conditional use permit. And that's a problem. So I think there are other ways of maybe handling how many schools should be in one area, how many businesses, or like there's zoning laws in place, but they misapplied it in this particular instance.
And to Mr. Baker, sounds like your staff didn't do a very good job of advising the council of all the little details that were relevant and important in this decision.
Actually, they did.
They told y'all that the church would be meeting on Saturday?
We had several. So what happens a lot of times, and I think this is where Jennifer is getting to, is that you want the property developed. What happened was, and this was before I became county executive, but what happened was no one actually asked what type of church it was going to be. And so they had no problem with the church and the community center and what they were going to bring to the community. It was when they found out it was going to be different from what they actually thought. It wasn't going to be a standard, Protestant Christian church that meets on Sundays, and the worship was different. That's when the change came with the community saying, we don't want it.
And my comment is, why didn't the staff tell the commissioners up front that this was the kind of church that was coming in?
That question, I don't know. And I wouldn't be surprised if they actually knew, but they were so interested in making sure the property that had sat vacant was developed. They were willing to go forward with it, have somebody buy it, at least bring in some revenues, and then come down. I don't think they expected it. And that's what happened. Sounds like what happened in this case. They wanted it developed. They knew this was a faith, church. And but when it went through, then they were like, okay, well, we can make them change and do something else.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word, but I think that's part of the issue why the federal law needs to be clear. And you should have no limitations regarding what you might be doing, in particular if you're a religious organization. Just making sure that you're being treated fairly is all we would possibly be looking for. Hey, Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So there was a Pew Research study that found that between the years of 2010 and 2020, the number of countries with Christian majorities, meaning that over half of the people there identified as Christian, dropped from 124 countries to 120. And that the researchers found that this may be because many people in those countries are now identifying as religiously unaffiliated.
Wow. Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that John Quincy Adams served in the House of Representatives in Congress at the same time a first-term unknown congressman from Illinois served there, Abraham Lincoln, and they came together over one critical issue, the abolishment of slavery?
I did not know that. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
Well, did you know that Michigan is the home to the world's only floating post office, the J.W. Westcott II, which delivers mail to ships passing through the St. Mary's River on their way to and from Solox?
Did not know that. Steve, tell me something I don't know.
I believe it is peace for our time. Did you know that British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain uttered these words in September of 1938? Right after meeting with Adolf Hitler, who had signed the Munich Agreement. But only 6 months later, Hitler broke the agreement and seized the entire country of Czechoslovakia.
Wow, can't trust anybody anymore, huh? Listen, great show today. Really appreciate your viewpoints. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.